The Apothecary Diaries has an ugly truth. Imagine being married off to some random man you've never met before you even turn 10 years old. Imagine being so poor that your own family has to sell you off just so that you can survive. You see, a lot of the things that happen in this show are based off of some real things that real people had to go through. This show doesn't hold back in illustrating the hardships that a lot of people had to face. And because of that, it can have some really uncomfortable scenes to watch. But despite all of those things, this show is actually really adorable. And it's all because of this character right here. I feel like a lot of shows get this type of character wrong, where they make the thing that makes the character weird, or the thing that's supposed to make the character stand out, something that always comes off as annoying or unnatural. It's never something that's actually unique. It's always some shit like, Mao Mao isn't like that. Her thing is that she likes to experiment with drugs and poisons and stuff like that, right? But she tests them on herself. Like, I can't emphasize enough just how obsessed she is with unironically almost fucking killing herself. She's a poison tester for one of the emperor's concubines in the rear palace. And this is like a really serious position to be in, right? Because people were trying to kill basically everybody for anything.
You're being reincarnated as a Chinese baby right now. Girl.
Sometimes she'll just be in her room giggling to herself, thinking about all the different experiments she could do, but she's not subtle about it at all. Like, you know, usually you wouldn't want somebody to hear you talking to yourself, but she just gets so caught up in herself that she just doesn't even notice how she looks to other people. She never has that moment where she finally stops and just looks at herself and is just like, but at the same time, she always tries to avoid actually getting involved with a lot of the drama and other stuff that happens around the inner palace, because for the most part, she'd rather just keep her head down and not draw a bunch of attention to herself. But deep down, she can't help herself because she's just really fucking nosy. She just gets so obsessed and excited to the point where she just can't control herself, and it's hilarious. Like, for example, one time they found the body of a woman that drowned right outside the rear palace. They needed to do an autopsy on the body, so they asked Mao Mao if she could do it, but she said she can't because her dad ordered her to never touch corpses. You could probably see where I'm going with this, but when they asked her why, she said, But the thing that makes me laugh about this scene is the fact that both Jinshi and Gaoshen just don't even really react to the unhinged stuff that she just said, and instead they both just look at her like, yeah, you would do some shit like that. But I think the more important part of this scene comes right after this. Jinshi and Mao Mao start looking more into the incident, and they figure out that the woman was probably murdered. Mao Mao would never intentionally take her own life, but if she were ever to make a mistake or anger the wrong person, that might not be something that she could control. And if that did happen, her only regret would be that she wouldn't be able to do any more of her experiments. She knows that if she were ever in this kind of situation, Jinshi would probably be the one to give the order. And out of pure impulse, she asked Jinshi, if you're ever tasked with executing me, can you make sure it's with poison? And immediately Jinshi is like, I would never do that. He would never do that to her because obviously he has feelings for her. And I think that his reaction to her saying that is just him letting his feelings for Mao Mao speak for him. But it's not a matter of whether or not he will do it, it's can he do it? And he's only really looking at what Mao Mao said as her speaking for herself as an individual. But Mao Mao isn't speaking for just herself. Mao Mao could put herself in the shoes of the woman from before, because at any point in time, that literally could have been her. And even before this moment, Jinshi was only really able to see these kinds of problems through the eyes of Mao Mao as an individual. It's why he gets confused whenever she starts talking about anything that's too personal, like when she tells him why she would intentionally make herself unattractive. These situations are examples of much bigger problems, problems that Mao Mao and people like her have to deal with on an everyday basis. And I think the reason why these types of situations involving Mao Mao confuse Jinshi so much is because these problems are so far removed from a person like Jinshi that he wouldn't even know to think about them. Which leads me to part 2. One of the first episodes in the show is a mystery about Lady Fuyo, one of the Emperor's concubines that's being sent off to a military officer. She'd been acting strange ever since she fell during her dance in front of the Emperor. They asked Mao Mao to look into it because people would walk back to their rooms and see her doing this shit at like 2 in the morning. But then the next time that you'd see her, she'd be perfectly fine and act like she wasn't just possessed by Satan himself the night before. But as Mao Mao starts to look more and more into Lady Fuyo's history, she realizes that she actually wanted to be sent off. She was offered to the emperor by her own family, and while she was in the inner palace, she spent her time trying to dodge his affection, all so that she could save herself for the man that she truly loved. Conveniently, the same man she was being sent off to. And that was the reason for her strange actions from before. Just like all of the other consorts at the royal palace, she had to officially separate from her family and wasn't allowed to go home. She was forced into a life that she couldn't choose for herself. They never outright say this, but I would assume that the same thing happened to all of the other emperor's concubines too. In the end, Lady Fuyo was able to choose love at the very least, but for many of the other concubines, they would never be able to say the same. For these women, love was just an afterthought. It was a luxury that they couldn't afford. It was the exact same situation for the women in the red light district too. Those women didn't come by choice either. Most of them were probably sold off by their own parents. Some were trafficked, and the rest offered themselves just so that they could have a place to stay and something to eat. And the sad reality about that is that that was probably the best option. As soon as you entered that life, you owed a debt to the people that took you in, and that was something that you'd probably spend your life paying off. Your best hope for freedom was to have a man come and pay that debt and buy you out, but even then, that came with its own problems because a lot of the men that did buy out these women only wanted to do so because they just wanted to legally own these women as their own. But what's really interesting is that despite all of those things, a lot of the women in the show still, at the very least, hope for love. Pyrin, Mei Mei, the other ladies in waiting, everybody except for Mao Mao. Remember earlier when I said that the women in this show didn't have a choice in the way that their lives went? Well, Mao Mao's a little different. She was forced into a life that she didn't choose, just like many of the other women were. But being an apothecary is exactly what she would have chose for her life. It's not that she directly had control in the way that her life has gone up until now, but she at the very least indirectly has control over the life that she has now. And even just that is more so than what most of the other women can say. But what's really interesting is at the same time, Mao Mao is still restrained by those same societal barriers mentally more so than the rest of the women in the show. Like I said before, unlike the rest of the women in the show, Mao Mao doesn't even hope for love. She never really outright says this, but I think one of the reasons why is because she doesn't even view herself as someone that's attractive enough for someone else to look at her in that way in the first place. She never calls herself ugly or anything like that, but she does pretty often compare her appearance to the other women she interacts with in negative ways. I mean, we're talking about a person that intentionally dulls their appearance in a society that tells women that their appearance is the only factor that determines their worth. She says that she only does that for her own safety, but I think it's actually much more than that. And I think that's also one of the same reasons why she experiments on herself too. And all of these things come from the fact that Mao Mao just doesn't believe in love in general.
そんな感情はきっと私を産んだ女の体内に置いてきてしまった。
Because as a child, Mao Mao was physically and mentally abused by her mother because she believed that Mao Mao was the reason for her losing her status as a high-ranking courtesan. Mao Mao never viewed that woman as her mother in the same way that she never viewed Mao Mao as her daughter. On top of the fact that her father was never in her life to begin with. So for her, she's never really known what love is, and it causes for her to have a very negative outlook on her life. She really conforms to that idea that she's inferior, way more so than anyone else, to the point where she just has no real expectation for anything to come out of a life for someone like her. In the very first episode after she gets kidnapped, her first thought was like, damn, it really do be like that sometimes, as if she just accepts that things like this happen to people like her. And she does expect things like this to happen to people like her because to her, the sad reality is that there's nothing she or anyone else can do about it. She doesn't see the value in her own life, but not in a way that's really dark or depressing. Remember, she said before that she would never willingly take her own life. She just has no hope. She's never had any hope. The women in this show are caged by society, but Mao Mao is also caged by herself. And that's the aspect of Mao Mao that surprised me the most. But it's also the same thing that made me realize this show is actually really adorable. The thing that I really love about watching Mao Mao and Jinchi together is the fact that there's so many layers to their relationship. It's really cute how playful they are with one another. Like Mao Mao will throw other women at Jinchi just so that he'll leave her alone. And Jinchi uses Mao Mao's obsession against her to make her do the different things that he wants, but not in a way to try to take advantage of her. I mean, he definitely tries, but the story doesn't use those moments as a cheap way to throw in some fan service that can just completely ruin the mood. It stays pretty innocent between the two of them, and I really enjoy that because it makes their relationship feel a lot more natural. It's also really funny how jealous Jinchi gets whenever she's around other dudes. Like, after he buys her out and she has to get all dressed up, when they finally get back to the palace, she gets out of the carriage and he goes... Or when she was talking to the military officer to try to figure out what caused the explosions in the warehouses, and Jinchi's just in the background staring at them. He's just as nosy as she is, but he's super territorial. And it's so stupid because everybody else clearly sees how close the two of them are, on top of the fact that Jinchi outranks literally everybody else in the inner palace. So there's nothing for him to be jealous of, but even still he's like... And God forbid if one day she actually ended up accidentally killing herself, testing poisons or experimenting on herself or whatever, Mao Mao would be perfectly fine with that because at least she went out on her own terms. But if that happened, oh my God! She acts like a fucking toddler and has zero regard for her life, and the entire time Jinchi's just trying his hardest to stop her from killing herself. But the thing that really makes me laugh is how he pouts. I don't know what it is, but when characters do this, it's just so funny to me. And it's the same thing whenever Mao Mao does some dumb shit and gets carried away with her experiments. Like, he never really directly says anything, he just makes these faces and projects out a ton of negative energy. I think that when a lot of people think back to their relationship, they're probably gonna look at the scene during the garden party as one of the defining moments. But I like to think that the scene where he buys her out was the first moment in the show where Jinchi really realized that he loved Mao Mao. Because right before this, Jinchi was put in an impossible situation where he had to choose between either firing Mao Mao or hiding some information to keep her working in the rear palace. Firing Mao Mao is what he was supposed to do, but by firing her, she wouldn't be in the rear palace anymore. He might never get the chance to see her again. And that would also mean that he would be essentially telling Mao Mao exactly what she had already thought of herself. But on the other hand, hiding the information to keep her working inside the rear palace could be the exact opposite of what Mao Mao wants. She was kidnapped from her home and forced to become a servant. How would she feel if she found out that Jinchi was the one that forced her to stay in a place that she hated? Whatever choice he made would always feel like the wrong one because he knows that Mao Mao would go along with whatever order he gives her. Which just brings him right back to that same situation that I mentioned before. He's literally put in the same situation. He never wanted to be, but again, that's not something that either of them can really control. And this situation here was just coincidence. But regardless of all of those things, Jinchi still has to do what needs to be done. And he has no choice but to fire her. And Jinchi feels horrible about it. It eats him up inside. He basically just told Mao Mao that in the end, she was expendable. She was always nothing more than just a tool. But in all actuality, that wasn't the case. And he realizes that she actually wanted to continue working in the rear palace. And right then and there, Jinchi realized that he was going to have to prove to her just how important she meant to him, which is why he immediately asked to buy her out. But it was going to take a lot more than just buying her out, because all that really does is just put her right back in the exact same situation that she was in before. It might have finally shown to her that he cares about her, but it doesn't show that her life has value. Which brings us to this scene right here. Jinchi was in the middle of a purification ritual. He had to cleanse himself of anything that could be considered dirty or unclean. Mao Mao, however, number one, as a woman, wasn't supposed to be there. Number two, she was injured and bleeding, and all of this was on top of the fact that she was just a servant. She figured out that somebody probably messed with the ceremonial tools, and if the ceremony wasn't stopped, it could mean someone important inside could get hurt or worse. But interrupting something as important as this would 100% get her executed. She knows all of this and she still does it anyways. Jinchi carrying Mao Mao during a moment as important as this, with her swollen face and bruised leg, just solidifies how much she actually means to him. He's not saying that to only Mao Mao, but to her father and to everyone else watching, that her life is just as important as anyone else's. And that's really cool. The story spends the last couple episodes setting up Lacan as this really shady character, someone that's even able to get under Jinchi's skin. He was a military leader, so using people as pawns came natural to him. He was someone that just used other people for his own amusement, and he literally only saw other people as chess pieces. He knew about who Jinchi really was, and he wanted to steal Mao Mao away from Jinchi. He was a guy who would frequently visit the brothel she grew up in, and every time he came, Mao Mao would have to hide away in the annex just to avoid crossing paths with him.
いつか押し倒してみたいと思っていたものですよ。
Wait a minute. Wait a minute.
And then fast forward to episode 18, when Jinchi tells Mao Mao that Lacan wanted to talk to her. And not gonna lie, when I first saw this moment, it happened so fast that I basically missed it. But then I went back and read the manga, and I think it does a way better job at illustrating the weight of despair in this moment. I don't think the anime really shows just how much of effect even hearing this guy's name had on Mao Mao. And I know a lot of people were really kind of blown away by this moment, but I don't think that the face she makes in the anime actually shows exactly what she was feeling. Like, to me here, it just looks like she's just really mad. Versus here in the manga, she hears his name, flinches, and then it's like... It was like a switch flipped in her head. She went from being her usual self to stone cold killer within like a matter of a second. And look at Jinchi, he looks like in this exact moment, he instantly felt all of that negative energy that she was giving off, and it terrifies him. Versus like in the anime, there's this almost awkward pause where the camera zooms out right before this happens. And then there's this wide shot of the entire courtyard that they're standing in. And I think that too kind of takes away from some of the emotions from this scene. Versus in the manga, the entire time it feels like they're both in this confined, enclosed space. Look at how close it feels like they're standing to each other. Versus in the anime, Jinchi is standing at the top of the stairs and Mao Mao is at the bottom, and it looks like there's a very clear distance between them. This looks really suffocating, like she just sucked all of the air out of the room. And it's the same thing after Mao Mao leaves. Jinchi's left alone in this confined space with the walls that look like they're almost closing in on him, and the chapter just hard ends right there, and you're left with that feeling just lingering on until the next chapter. Versus in the anime, the episode just continues on for a couple more minutes right after this, almost as if this moment wasn't as important as it felt. And then the reveal that Lacan actually wasn't this horrible person, the same type of person that Mao Mao was afraid of being taken by in the red light district, changed my entire perspective on this guy in just one episode. Because this entire time, for years, all this guy has been trying to do, all he's ever wanted to do is just have a relationship with Mao Mao. It was both beautiful and tragic, and so well written, because the only faces he'd ever seen in his life were of the woman he fell in love with and the daughter he never got the chance to have a relationship with. And then on top of the fact that when he finally does reunite with Mao Mao's mother again, he still sees her in the same way that he saw her when they first met. It felt like he was able to finally release all of the emotions that were built up over the years of thinking that the worst had happened to her, and even for a period of time to Mao Mao. This moment was definitely heartwarming, but the one part about it that I haven't really seen anyone talking about is Mei Mei's reaction. And when I first watched the show, I didn't really think much of it. It wasn't until I read the manga that I realized that there was actually so much more to this scene that the anime just didn't show. Lacan had been going into the brothel as much as he could ever since he found out that Mao Mao was his daughter, but that entire time, Mao Mao refused to see him, and everyone else had that same negative idea about him because of what had happened. And the only person that would see him was Mei Mei. And at this point in the story, Mao Mao is around like 17 years old, I think, and the first time he saw her, I assume she was probably around like 3 to 5 years old. So we're talking about basically over a decade where all he's been able to do is come into the brothel and talk to Mei Mei. During that time, he definitely expressed his feelings and probably told her what really happened. And during that time, she probably developed feelings for him after spending so much time with him and listening to his stories. There's also a couple of scenes in the show where they hint at the idea that Mei Mei kind of wanted to retire and settle down. And then you have this panel where she says, if you'd been honest about your feelings from the start, this all could have been over and done with before I had the chance to get my hopes up. But they cut that line out of the anime. I don't know, maybe some people just didn't catch that part, or they just thought it took away from the overall moment. But I thought that this one line really just tied everything together so beautifully, and it made this moment so much more amazing than it already was. There was so much pent up emotions in this one scene alone from so many different characters, and it all just released at once, and it was just so satisfying. Mei Mei definitely wanted Lacan to buy her out, but in her heart, she felt it was wrong for her to be bought out of pity because he didn't truly love her, or at the very least, he didn't love her in the same way that he loved Mao Mao's mother. I don't know, maybe that's just me being nitpicky or whatever, but if you didn't read the manga, please go read it and then rewatch the scene and tell me if you felt the same. The show made me laugh, it made me cry. This was a show that I wasn't expecting at all to take me on such an emotional roller coaster, but I enjoyed every step of the way. And if this show was able to do all of that within the span of just one season, I can't wait for what happens in the next one.